Today we have Yannis, who is actually a colleague from economic department. I know Yannis. We actually met online and in person in some meetings. I think those meetings are mainly research related meetings, because you are the research director of the economic department. So Yannis is very passionate about research and research activities. So he is actively, and he has organized some, I think, the recent research workshops, and that I think they were very helpful. So you invited some editors, so we discussed the issues in submission and revising, so which is really, really good for particularly for research oriented, member of staffs. So that's part of your activity at SOAS. You contributed a lot, and you are a reader in economic department, and you yourself has done quite some research in financial macroeconomics and also climate finance and ecological macroeconomics and related topics. And I noticed that you have published in some good journals, peer-reviewed academic journals, such as Cambridge Journal of Economics, Ecological Economics, and others. Also, I see that you were involved in, you were the principal investigators or investigators of some research projects in your field, and you organized some trainings to some banks and other organizations. As people can see, Yannis also is sitting on editorial board for quite a few journals, and those journals, to be honest, some of them I heard, but some not. So overall, Yannis, you are welcome to the seminar, and I think your topic is very relevant for some of our finance department colleagues as well. Also, development studies. So you are going to today. I think the topic is about how to consider climate or green effort in financing. Okay, let's say that way. So I'm very interested in hearing what you are going to talk about, but as I said, that you feel free to deliver whatever you think that is informative for our audience. So without further ado, I will give the floor to you, Yannis. Please, you can start.
Thank you so much, Hong, for the introduction. That was very kind, and thanks for having me. I mean, it's always a pleasure to present in the seminar series of the Center for Global Finance. So what I'm going to talk about is related to the broader area of climate finance, and in particular, the area related to how we can incorporate climate issues into central banking. I have been working on this area for a few years now, and there have been several interesting debates about what central banks can do in terms of reacting to the climate crisis. Initially, the reaction of central banks was that dealing with the climate crisis in any way is not part of their job. So I remember when we had the initial discussions with some central banks, including Bundesbank or the ECB or the Bank of England, let's say in 2018, 2019, I think they didn't want to focus so much on that topic, but things have changed quite substantially. And now central banks have done a lot of work on climate. So the Bank of England has done, for instance, a climate stress test. The ECB has done something similar. ECB has also done some interesting stuff with their quantitative easing program, and 2 or 3 years ago. And around the world, now central banks want to engage quite a lot with the climate debates. And one of the reasons is that they see climate change as one additional source of financial risk. So the transition to a low carbon economy, if it happens, can have a lot of implications for carbon intensive companies. So they have realized that if the financial system is exposed to carbon intensive companies, then there are some risks that they have to take into account when they do their analysis about the exposure of financial institutions. And of course, you can easily imagine that if we don't manage to keep global warming within 1.5 or 2 degrees, we're going to see a lot of climate-related events around the world, and of course in Europe as well. So central banks have done a lot of analysis about that right now. So this is the broader area that the topic of my paper is related to. So let me share my slides. Hopefully you can see them well. And my paper is related in particular to what the ECB does, and more precisely is related to the so-called Eurosystem Collateral Framework. So I will explain a bit what this is. It's one of the tools that the ECB uses in order to make sure that the commercial banks in the euro area have access to central bank liquidity. And there's a very interesting history behind this collateral framework. I'm going to explain some details in a bit. But in terms of the broader debate, as I said, the ECB has now engaged quite a lot with the climate agenda. They have a specific department that focuses on climate change. They run climate stress testing exercises. They ask commercial banks to do analysis about climate-related financial risks. And 2 years ago, they decided to decarbonize their quantitative easing program by developing some indicators to calculate what is the climate performance of different bond issuers. And based on this performance, they reallocated a little bit their purchases. So it's quite interesting to see these developments, and there have been a lot of debates about what the ECB has done. But the ECB has not yet done so much on the collateral framework, the tool that I'm going to discuss today. They have said that they have done some analysis about the climate risks in this framework, and they have also announced a kind of a small modification in this tool with respect to climate. But there's a debate about how exactly the ECB can do that and whether the ECB should incorporate climate issues into the collateral framework. And before I explain the collateral framework, let me say that when we look at what central banks can do in order to react to the climate crisis, there are two ways to think about that. The first way is what we call in this paper the climate footprint approach, which is a kind of an approach whereby central banks do make changes to their tools based on how well bond issuers or borrowers perform from a climate perspective. So this approach focuses quite a lot on what are, for instance, the emissions of companies, how much they have reduced their emissions, what are the targets in terms of reducing their emissions, what are the activities that they engage in. And based on that, the central banks can penalize those companies, for instance, that do not perform very well from a climate perspective, and can support more companies that do better. So this is a very climate-oriented approach. The second approach is where central banks focus on measuring climate risk. So this is a simple extension of what central banks already do. So central banks, including the ECB, analyze the exposure of financial system to risks. One way through which they analyze that is by using the stress testing exercises, but they also have financial supervision, regulation, and so on. And the idea is that the ECB, according to this approach, should analyze climate risk from a financial perspective and incorporate this into the tools that they use. So in the paper, the idea is to show you how the application of these two approaches can affect the collateral framework and what this would mean for bond issuers in the euro area. We are using microdata for bonds, microdata for companies. I'm going to present you some scenarios about climate risks. NGFS stands for the Network for Greening the Financial System. It's a global central banking network that focuses on climate issues. It was launched in 2017. And it has done a lot of work in terms of developing scenarios related to climate-related financial risks. So we use these scenarios in order to analyze these risks. And the idea is to explain what these two approaches would imply in practice if they are implemented by the ECB. But let me say first a few things about the Eurosystem Collateral Framework, why it is important. Then I will explain some theoretical issues around the two approaches. I will spend some time to explain the methods that we use in the paper. This is where I will become a little bit more technical, but I will try to keep a balance between the intuition and the technical aspects. And then I will show you some results. Let me say that this is a paper that is still in progress. So I'm going to present you some main results, but we are still working on some specific aspects of the results. So I would be very happy to get your thoughts and your feedback. So the Eurosystem Collateral Framework. Now, what is the idea behind collateral frameworks? The idea is that whenever central banks provide money to commercial banks, they want to get a guarantee that if commercial banks cannot return this money, there will be a minimization of financial losses for central banks. This is the initial idea behind the collateral framework. So, as is the case with the mortgage market, where there's a house as a collateral, in the case of financial markets, what is used as a collateral is not a real asset, it's a financial asset. So a collateral, for instance, can be a government bond. So the idea is that the ECB provides some liquidity to a bank, let's say 90,000 euros or something like that. And then the bank should provide a government bond as a collateral that needs to have a higher value than the amount of the amount of loan. Why? Because if the price of the bond goes down during the period of the borrowing, the ECB wants to make sure that they aren't going to have financial losses. So if the initial value of this bond is, for instance, 100,000 euros, and you get a loan equal to 90,000 euros, then it means that even if the price goes down a bit, you will still be above 90,000 euros, so there will be no financial losses. Now, this difference is called the haircut. And the higher the haircut, the lower the confidence that we have about the price of a bond. So if we expect that a bond is not going to perform well from a price perspective and is going to see a reduction in its price, it makes sense to ask for a higher haircut. Which means that if, for instance, a commercial bank wants to get access to liquidity, they need to provide a bond that will have a much higher value compared to the amount of loan that they want to get. So the higher the haircut, the higher the perceived risk in the financial markets about this specific bond. And this is important because if you have very high haircuts, it means that you cannot easily use a specific bond to get a lot of liquidity from the central bank. And let me give you also an example in order to illustrate the importance of the collateral framework. You know that in 2015, there was a crisis in the Greek banks. There was a kind of a bank run when there was a political crisis and the referendum and so on. Now, in principle, Greek banks, since they were part of the euro area, they had access to the ECB liquidity. But the ECB evaluated the Greek bonds as being of very low quality, so they were not willing to accept them as collateral. As an implication of this, commercial banks in Greece could not access ECB liquidity. And therefore, there was a liquidity problem, and this is why there was a bank run. So the reason why I'm saying that is to illustrate that it's important for commercial banks to make sure that they will always have enough financial assets that are accepted as collateral by the ECB. If they don't have that, there's a risk of illiquidity. Now, what the ECB does is that every day it provides a very detailed list of all the securities that it accepts as collateral. And in particular, the list that refers to marketable assets like bonds is available online, so everyone can download this specific list. And then commercial banks know what are exactly the assets that they can use in order to get access to central bank liquidity. Now, in order for an asset to be included in the ECB collateral framework, it should be issued in specific currencies, primarily euro, but also US dollar, sterling, and yen. It should be issued by an institution that is in specific countries, basically high-income countries, and the bond should be rated investment grade. So it should be of high credit quality. And based on this criteria, the ECB decides what will be included in the collateral list. Now, in the analysis for this paper, we are going to focus on a specific part of this list, which is corporate bonds. So what is interesting is that the ECB does not only have government bonds in the collateral framework, they also have a lot of private assets, including corporate bonds. And overall, the corporate bond, the value that corresponds to the corporate bonds that are included in the collateral framework is about 2 trillion. So it's not, it's quite important. Now, the reason why the ECB does this evaluation is because they want to understand also not only what should be included in the eligibility list, but also what will be the haircuts of bonds. And the ECB does a specific analysis about the credit quality of bonds. They take into account the coupon type, if it is fixed, floating, or zero, because this has implications about risks. And they also consider the residual maturity. So the higher the maturity, the higher the uncertainty about the ability to repay debt. So based on this criteria, they determine what are the haircuts. So you might be a company, let's say BP, you issue a bond, and you really want this to be included in the collateral framework. Why? Because if it is included in the collateral framework, it means that there will be a demand for this bond from commercial banks. Why? Because commercial banks need this bond in order to get access to ECB liquidity. Then, if this is included, you also want, in principle, as a company, to see a low haircut, because if the haircut is low, it means that banks can get a lot of liquidity by using this bond. So there have been a lot of empirical studies that have shown that those bonds that are in the collateral framework have lower yields. And if they have lower haircuts, the yields can be even lower. So from that perspective, it's always very important for big companies to see their bonds in the collateral framework, because this means that they will always have a lot of demand whenever they need some finance. And now, this is more or less the idea behind the collateral framework. Now, as you can understand, this framework has implications for the cost of borrowing. This is why we need to think about this issue also from a climate perspective. Why? Because, as I will explain in a bit, there are many fossil fuel companies that are included in the collateral framework. And this means that the fact that they are included there means that at the end of the day, there's a guarantee that there will always be a low bond yield, irrespective of what they do about climate. So we have seen that the representation of carbon-intensive companies is quite high in the collateral framework. And many people have argued that this is not very good for climate, because it means that at the end of the day, the ECB supports quite a lot a part of the economy that is considered to be a problem from a climate perspective. And there's no pressure from a financial perspective on these companies to adjust and reduce their emissions. Now, the other problem is that if we have the implementation of policies, climate policies, in the coming years, some of these carbon-intensive companies might have to pay quite a lot because of high carbon prices, for instance. So if we have a carbon tax that is going to increase quite a lot in the coming years, some of these companies will have some financial expenses that perhaps will make them more financially fragile. And from a risk perspective, it's important to take this into account. So I have here the two approaches that I described before about how the collateral framework can incorporate climate issues. So the first one is the climate footprint, where you focus on climate, the climate performance, and you basically try to address the climate problem. The second one is where you try to address the exposure of the financial system to some financial climate risks. So what is the difference between these two approaches from a policy and conceptual perspective? Now, let me start with the climate footprint approach and explain what I call the conceptualization of climate risks in the table. So the idea is that when we are looking at the financial system, we need to use this concept of double materiality. Double materiality means that if you have a financial institution, this institution is affected by climate risk. Why? Because it is exposed to some climate risks. So from climate, we go to the financial institution, but there's also a reverse causality because the financial institution can affect climate risks. How? We know that many financial institutions provide a lot of fossil finance, right? For many decades, they have done that. So by providing this finance, they contribute indirectly to emissions that are bad for global warming. So by doing that, they contribute also to climate change. And the idea of this approach is that we would like to find a way to reduce the support of finance to carbon-intensive companies and make finance greener by reallocating funds towards, let's say, greener bonds or greener loans. So the climate footprint approach tries to change that. So it evaluates borrowers, bond issues, and so on, based on their climate performance and tries to change how much finance supports dirty stuff that is bad for the environment. The climate risk approach doesn't care about the effects of financial institutions on climate. It focuses on why climate is bad for the financial system. So this is why the direction of impact is just from climate risk to the financial system. And this is more or less the approach that, let's say, the more conventional approach of central banks. So central banks say that we cannot change the climate crisis. This is basically the work of governments to change that. Our work is to understand if the financial system is exposed to climate risks. So this is the different way that these two approaches analyze the interaction between finance and climate. Now, the policy target in the case of the climate footprint approach is to try to reduce systemic risks in the case of climate footprint approach. Why systemic risk? Because if you have that all financial institutions around the world try to decarbonize their portfolio, their loans, and so on, then you get a lot of global warming. I mean, they contribute to the reduction of global warming. So credit creation process overall contributes more to solving the problem instead of creating more problems. And from that perspective, we know that at the system level, if we have less global warming, we have a less fragile system. So the idea is for central banks to contribute to these efforts. For the climate risk approach, the idea is for central banks to protect the exposure of the financial system to climate risks. Right. So it's about a protection from something exogenous that is bad for the financial system. Now, when it comes to collateral framework, this is a policy implementation issue. In the case of climate footprint, what we are doing in the paper to apply this approach is that we adjust the haircuts based on how green or dirty the bond issuers are. And we also consider cases where we exclude some very high carbon assets from the collateral framework. So it's very climate driven. I will explain the details later. While in the case of climate risk approach, what we have is that we take into account how climate risks can affect the probabilities of default. And in most cases, they are likely to increase probabilities of default. And based on this, we adjust haircuts. So it's a very standard approach. And you just need to extend your credit risk analysis. Now, how does the climate footprint approach can affect the economy? I mean, the idea is that by reallocating a little bit what is eligible and adjusting haircuts, you create demand for greener bonds and you reduce demand for carbon-intensive bonds. So you change the demand for bonds depending on the climate performance. And if, for instance, the ECB announces which are the good and the bad climate performance, it also provides a signal to the markets that at the end of the day, it's not a good idea for financial markets to buy carbon-intensive bonds because they might, these bonds will not have a high demand in the future because central banks don't want to engage with these companies that are not very good climate performance. So this is how this can affect the cost of borrowing in the economy. In the case of the climate risk approach, the idea is to provide some signals through, let's say, correcting the pricing of bonds. Because if you incorporate climate risks into your analysis about haircuts, then the haircuts provide a signal about which bonds seem to be more risky. But this is a very standard risk perspective. So these are the two different approaches. Let me say from the beginning that overall, the ECB right now is more in favor of course, of the climate risk approach. However, they used a version of the climate footprint approach when they decided to decarbonize their quantitative easing program. And if you ask, for instance, Christine Lagarde, maybe Lagarde would be happy to consider the climate footprint approach as they did with the QE program, but many other members of the Governing Council would prefer much more the climate risk approach. So there's also kind of a political debate about that. Now, I'm going to describe how exactly we implement these approaches from a quantitative perspective. I will start with the climate footprint approach, and then I will turn to the risk one. And let me say that when I describe the climate risk approach, I will also explain a little bit how central banks have tried to do climate stress testing analysis. So what I'm going to explain in terms of what we do in the paper is also very close to the stress testing exercise of the Bank of England and the ECB. So hopefully this also might be useful for you in case you are interested in what central banks have done so far on stress testing. But let me start with the climate footprint approach. So the idea is that we want to evaluate bond issuers based on how well they perform from a climate perspective. Now, the big question is, how do you evaluate companies when you want to analyze their climate impact? Now, let me say that I'm not a fan of ESG because I think ESG incorporates a lot of different stuff. There are different methodologies. There's a black box, so we're not using ESG. What we do is that we use company level data about emissions, because emissions is something very concrete that we can take into account and evaluate companies. But we also use data about the key activities of companies, the main activities that companies engage in. We also take into account if we have a bond that is considered to be green. You might know that there is a green bond market over the last 15 years or so, and there's a process through which green bonds can be certified. So we take into account if a bond is green or not. It's important to analyze the activities of companies. For instance, there's a big difference if you have a company that is in the mining sector compared to a company that is in the education sector. So we need to take this into account. And the reason why this is important is because there are some problems with the availability of Scope 3 emissions data. So we use from ICON, which is our main data source for this paper, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions availability is not so great. And Scope 3 emissions are important. Why? Because you have, for instance, that in the fossil fuel sector, the vast majority of emissions are Scope 3 emissions. Why? Because fossil fuel companies do not burn the fossil fuels. These are burned later, but they have responsibility about these emissions. So because of the fact that we don't have Scope 3 emissions data, it's even more important to look at the specific activities of companies. So this is the information that we use, and we develop 2 or 3 different indicators in order to capture this. Let me say that what I'm going to say now about the indicator related to emissions is very, very close to the approach that both the Bank of England and the ECB used for their key programs in order to evaluate bond issuers. Ours is a little bit different in terms of some details. We are a little bit stricter with companies than the ECB and the Bank of England, but the approach is very similar. So from an emissions perspective, we look at 3 things. We look first at the carbon intensity of the bond issuers compared to what happens in the sector that they belong to. So carbon intensity is the ratio of emissions to revenues. So we look at the data that we have from ICON about the level of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions compared to the revenues of companies. And there are some companies that are below the sector average and companies that are above that. So we first evaluate where the companies are compared to their peers. But this is not enough, because at the end of the day, we also need to look at absolute emissions. You might have a company with relatively good carbon intensity, but still with a lot of emissions. And from a climate perspective, this is a problem. So what we do is that we look at how much the absolute emissions of companies have changed over the last 3 years. This is important because then we can see to what extent the company has made some progress in terms of reducing their emissions. On top of it, and this is a third indicator, we look at the targets that companies have about reducing their carbon emissions. So on average, if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement targets, each company has to reduce its emissions by about 9-10% every year. It's very approximate, but this is more or less what in principle would make us consistent with the Paris Agreement targets. So we look at how far the targets of companies are from this 10% or so. And this is important because in many cases, companies argue that they might have been so far quite carbon intensive, but they have some very ambitious plans about becoming less carbon intensive, and we're going to take this into account. So we consider the plans. Let me say that, of course, who knows whether the plans will be materialized. This is why this is just one of the indicators. It's not the only thing that drives our evaluation, but we take into account if a company has a target. So this is the index about the emissions of companies. Now, I have some formulas. Perhaps I'm not going to go into so many details. What I would like to say is that for each one of these indicators, we develop a formula. We normalize the formula in order to take values between 0 and 2. 2 is bad for climate, 0 is good for climate. So for instance, here we compare the carbon intensity of each company with the carbon intensity of the sector that it belongs to. If the carbon intensity is very high, the index becomes closer to 2. And we put this everything within 0 and 2. This is a more complicated index about what has happened in the last 3 years in terms of the reduction of emissions. And basically, 2 means that companies have either kept their emissions the same or have even increased their emissions. Then they took a value equal to 2. They take 0 if they have performed much better than the Paris Agreement target. This is the rationale, so I don't want to go into so many details, but in terms of how exactly we develop the formula, we do something similar for the forward-looking indicator. This is the third aspect that I mentioned before. And if a company, for instance, has a target to reduce emissions by 20% every year, they're going to take 0 in this indicator, which is very good. Otherwise, if they are very bad, they take 2. And what we do is that we develop this emissions-based climate index for each company that depends on these 3 indicators. We have 3 different weights. We put more weight to carbon intensity and what has happened in the past, and the lower weight to what might happen in the future, because we really don't know if companies will achieve their targets. We do a sensitivity analysis with different weights, so we can play with the weights to see what happens, because these weights are subjective to some extent. I mean, it's and also the Bank of England and ECB did something similar, so they put some weights there. But you can change the weights in order to have a sensitivity analysis. This develops our first indicator about emissions. Okay, but hopefully you got the main idea in terms of how we do that. Now, second indicator, we rely on the main activities of companies. So we have from ICON a very detailed classification of the activities. We use a combination of the NACE classification of activities and the classification that is provided by Refinitiv ICON, the Refinitiv business classification. And we try to specify which are these activities that are more carbon intensive than others, and which are the activities that are clearly green. And based on that, we assign better values, let's say, to companies that are in green activities and worse values for companies that are in dirty activities. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with the fact that in the EU, we have now a taxonomy of sustainable activities. There was a lot of work from the European Commission on that in the previous years. So this is one of the things that we use as a basis for our analysis. But in the academic literature, there have also been a lot of classifications. One of these is the climate policy relevant sectors classification, which analyzes basically the carbon intensive activities. So what we do in the paper is that we use this one specific approach related to the EU taxonomy and the climate policy relevant sectors. And these are the types of sectors that you can find, for instance, in NACE. And what we do is that we look at some activities that are potentially green, like in the manufacturing batteries or low carbon technologies. We don't want to have a dummy 0 or 1. We want to have a kind of a continuous variable. And for instance, when we look at electricity production in Europe, if you know that the company is a utility in Europe, on average, 30% of the energy that is generated is from renewables right now in Europe. So because we don't have the granular data per company, what we do is that when we see a company that is a utility, we say that it's not 100% green, but it's not 100% dirty. So we just have 35% green in the way that we evaluate the company. And this is a proxy that we use because we don't have the granular data. I mean, ideally, we would like to have data about the source of energy that each utility uses. We don't have this data, but we use as a proxy the activity that they engage in. And based on this, we assign some values between 0 and 1. So 1 is the best, 0 is the worst one. And then we look at the taxonomies about carbon-intensive activity. So this includes fossil fuels, dirty manufacturing, carbon-intensive transport, and so on. And then this coefficient, the higher the value it is, the worse for climate. So when we look at the mining of coal, for instance, this is very bad for climate. It will take a value equal to 1, which is bad. If we have that there are some activities in the manufacturing sector, and part of these activities are not necessarily dirty, because we have now that the manufacturing sector is in a transition period, so they are trying to reduce carbon intensity, then we assign a kind of a lower value compared to 1, so closer to 0. So we have green activities, dirty activities. We develop a taxonomy based drawing on the EU taxonomy and previous academic literature. And then we have an indicator that I have here. We call it activities-based climate index. It's the second indicator for each company. And this indicator, this is the transition exposure coefficient, which is how dirty the activities are. This is taxonomy-aligned coefficient. So if you have 2 here, you have 1 in this indicator, 0 here, it's very bad. So as in the previous indicator, 2 is bad. If you have 0, it means that you have 0 dirty activity, and you have 1 here for the taxonomy, the green activity, so you get 0, this is good. So we combine then this indicator with the previous one, and the final thing that we do is that we look specifically at the fossil fuel sector. There is a specific list provided by Ungerwald, and they have looked at the plans of fossil fuel companies. And when we have a company that is a fossil fuel and they have expansion plans related to coal, gas, or oil, we take this into account, because it means that these companies don't have very strong commitments to address climate change. And we don't want to penalize all fossil fuel companies. We want to penalize those companies that have future plans that are bad for the environment. This is why we also have this indicator. So at the end of the day, we combine all these indicators. We put weights. Again, weights can be arbitrary, but you can do sensitivity analysis. And then we follow something similar as the Bank of England and the ECB. We classify companies, in our case, bond issuers, into 4 different buckets. So A, B, C, D. A is very strong climate performance. D are very poor climate performance. So the closer you are to 2, the more likely it is to be to bucket C or D. The closer you are to 0, according to our indicator, the more likely it is for you to be in bucket A or B. And this is nice because then you know where the companies are. And what is important is that even if a company is in bucket D, there are ways for them to go to bucket B or A. How? They can reduce their emissions in the future. They can have commitments about the emissions. They can change. They can, let's say, postpone, cancel plans about fossil fuel expansion. So there are options to companies when they want to change their climate performance. And this is important because it means that then you have an option to incentivize companies. You don't penalize all companies irrespective of what they're going to do. You tell them, you start from D, but if you manage to get to B or A, then you will have a better treatment from central banks. So I think this also provides some good incentives. On top of it, whenever a company issues a green bond, this bond will be evaluate it in a quite positive way. So for this green bond, they can get a treatment that is close to bucket A and B. So we also take this into account, which is another way for companies also to decarbonize their production. Now, what we do, and this is a final step for the climate footprint approach, and again, let me not go into the details about the formulas, is that we take the haircuts from the ECB, and then we adjust them depending on whether a company is in a climate bucket A, B, C, or D. So we start from bucket D, and we say, for instance, that if you are in bucket D, then you are going to see an increase in haircut, let's say by 20%. So the policymaker has to decide about that. Then the next step is to go to bucket C and say, okay, you're not going to get 20% increase in your haircut, you're going to get 50% of that because you are a bit better. So let's say 10%. And then in bucket B and A, we have the opposite. We have that the haircuts go down. Why? Because again, haircuts, when they are lower, it's good for a bond. It means that there will be high demand for this bond. So we adjust the haircuts based on this. And policymakers can decide about how they can do that. I mean, how much they want to penalize the bad performers. And then what is a crucial thing is the following. If you change the haircuts, it means that for those banks that don't have enough, let's say, many carbon-intensive bonds, by increasing the haircuts, there's a risk that they might not have enough access to liquidity. And this might be a problem from a financial stability perspective. So what we do is that we adjust the haircuts in the green, let's say in the climate bucket A and climate bucket B, in a way that allows us to increase the availability of collateral for those who are willing to buy greener bonds. So what does it mean in practice? It means that, okay, you get that for fossil bonds, for instance, haircuts increase, but then you have quite significantly lower haircuts in the green bond market, and therefore you can get this, and by doing that, you can get more access to liquidity from the central bank. And what we do is that we do that in a way that does not reduce the availability of collateral overall. This is what we do with the last formula. So we adjust everything in order to make sure that there will be no problem with the availability of collateral. Now, let me turn now to the risk approach. I mean, this is a formula we use for the adjustment, so it's exactly what I described before. Now, in the case of a climate risk exposure approach, we need to understand how climate risks are going to materialize in the coming years. And there's a consensus in the central bank community that we have to consider many different scenarios. We cannot just say that this is what is going to happen, because we really don't know how quickly the transition will happen, if it happens at any point in time soon. So we need to develop scenarios. So NGFS has developed several scenarios, and central banks use the scenarios in order to do analysis about credit risks. In our case, we are very much interested in how these scenarios can affect the probability of default of companies, because this is one of the indicators for specifying haircuts. Now, I have on the slide 3 scenarios that we consider in the paper. We have the current policy scenarios, whereby things are more or less the same as they are right now, so business as usual. Some climate policies are implemented in the coming years, but not very ambitious policies that would allow us to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement. There's another scenario which is called delayed transition scenario, the second one, whereby we have business as usual by 2030, but after 2030, there is a significant action from a climate perspective, and we have high carbon prices around the world, and this means that we managed to reduce global warming quite a lot compared to the business as usual scenario. And there's another scenario, it is called Net Zero 2050 scenario, whereby actually climate action has already started, and this action will be very ambitious and will allow us to achieve 1.5 degrees at the end of the century, which is basically the target of the Paris Agreement. So current policy scenarios, business as usual. Delay scenario, things start changing after 2030. They remain the same as they are right now until then. net zero 2050, the transition is happening actually this year. Now, in terms of how things look like, I have here a couple of graphs. So this is a carbon price, and the carbon price is measured in US dollars per ton of CO2. And we can see that with the current policies, the carbon price remains very close to zero. In the other scenario where things start after 2030, you can see that carbon price increases quite substantially after 2030. And there's a third scenario whereby the carbon price is already high and is continuing to increase in the coming years. What are the implications of changes in carbon prices? The implications are related to the pathway of emissions. So in the current policy scenarios, emissions at the global level remain more or less the same. So small reductions after some point, but more or less the same. This is the current policy scenario. In the delayed transition scenario, emissions start going down after 2030. And there's the net zero scenario whereby emissions are already declining and they go actually to net zero by 2050. These are the differences in terms of emissions. Now, we use the data about these scenarios, and drawing on the work of the ECB about climate stress testing, we use 4 specific channels through which climate policies in particular, can affect the financial position of companies. So let me explain these 4 channels in turn. The first one is the fossil energy cost channel. This is how we call it. And it has to do directly with carbon prices. So there will be some companies that generate a lot of Scope 1 emissions. Let me say that Scope 1 emissions, in case you don't, are the direct emissions. So whenever we have the burning of fossil fuels, whenever we use heating systems that rely on gas, we produce Scope 1 emissions. And in the manufacturing sector, there's a lot of production of Scope 1 emissions, for instance. So when there's a carbon price, it depends on which sectors are covered by the carbon price. But the idea is that at some point, most of the sectors should be covered by carbon prices. So the increase in carbon prices can increase the cost of firms because they will have to pay for these emissions. So this means that the profitability of firms can go down. Right, this is one option. The other option is that firms will pass this on to prices and will avoid a reduction in their profitability. But this will also have negative effects on the economy. But the key issue here is that the operating expenses of firms will increase because of the carbon price directly. Second channel, electricity cost channel. Now, what happens is that if we achieve decarbonization, we will have 2 implications. One implication is that we will rely more on electricity because electricity is good from a renewables perspective. If we have a transport system that relies on electricity, it's good because if we generate electricity by using renewables, then we don't generate emissions. So we expect that in the transition scenarios, the use of electricity will go up. But this means that firms might have to pay more on electricity. It depends on the price. And carbon prices initially can increase the cost of energy. So initially, you can have a significant increase in the expenses for electricity. Once we have decarbonization, the cost of electricity will go down. And this is good because in the long run, with renewables, we can have a very, very low cost of electricity. But until this happens, during the transition, we might see an increase in electricity costs. So we also need to take this into account when we analyze the financial position of companies. Then there will be some effects on revenues of companies. Why? Because if you are a mining company and there is a transition, of course, you will not have the same sales, and unless you change your business model. But if you don't do that, then you will have a reduction in your revenue. So we also consider that, and there will be more demand for electricity. So renewables-based utilities in particular will see an increase in their revenues. The final channel is the green investment channel. And it's quite interesting because if we look at the scenarios about the transition, what we need to see in the coming years is a very high increase in the capacity, in the capacity to generate electricity from renewables. And this requires a lot of investment. But firms cannot rely only on their internal funds to finance this investment. They will also rely on loans. And this means that their leverage can go up if we take seriously these scenarios, because finance needs to come from somewhere, and part of it will come from banks and the bond market. So we expect an increase in the liabilities of firms, especially those that will engage with green investment. So these are the 4 channels that we have to consider, and all this can affect many financial variables in our analysis. So we follow the approach of the ECB, and we download data from ICON about different types of financial variables, and then we develop a kind of a dynamic analysis from 2023 to 2050, and we see how much specific financial variables will change depending on the scenario. And I have here the list of variables that we consider. So it's total assets, the overall expenses, the fossil energy cost. So we analyze all these variables. And the idea is that what we're going to get at the end of the day is the impact on the probability of default. And in terms of the probability of default, what we do is that we connect the probability of default with the leverage and profitability of firms, and profitability and leverage are affected by all the other variables. So you have a dynamic analysis whereby probability of default can change every year. Now, let me, since I explained the rationale, I have some formulas, but let me not explain this in detail. Just to say that what we do, for instance, in the case of emissions and carbon prices, is that we assume that firms change their emissions depending on the scenario, and they have to pay a price depending on how much they produce, they generate from an emissions perspective. So the more they generate emissions, the more they have to pay. The higher the cost, the lower the profitability, and therefore the higher the probability of default. So we have all these formulas. In terms of the probability of default, let me just say that because it's quite important for our analysis. We use an econometric approach. So we use a kind of a logistic regression that we take actually from ECB. And ECB has estimated this by using detailed company level data. So it's a panel, they have used a panel regression in order to do that. So we get how much changes in profitability and changes in the leverage ratio affect the probability of default. So we use coefficients based on what has happened in the past. And based on these coefficients, we estimate how profitability and leverage can affect probabilities of default. So this is more or less the idea. Once you have the probabilities of default, then we look at how the ECB determines the haircuts of bonds. And I have here the tables that are provided by the ECB about that. I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that there are 3 criteria that the ECB takes into account. The first one is the type of coupon. So they make a distinction between zero coupon and fixed or floating coupon. Second, they look at the maturity of bonds. And third, they look at credit quality. So what we do is that for each bond, we look at the residual maturity, we look at what type of coupon we have, and we take the value from these tables depending on what is the credit quality. Now, credit quality is evaluated by using the probabilities of default. We know that the ECB assigns a probability of default below 0.1% to the best quality bonds. And when probability of default is above 1.0% and below 0.4%, this is the second category in the previous table, so the haircuts are slightly higher. Once the probability of default becomes higher than 0.4%, then the bonds should not be eligible for the collateral framework. So what we do is that we estimate probabilities of default, and depending on where they are, we assign haircuts. And you might have that a probability of default can increase at some point, but it has to pass specific thresholds in order to get an increase in haircuts. Now, before I show you our results, I would like to highlight that the ECB focuses on 1 year probability of default. So the idea is that they want to understand what is going to happen in the next year. From a climate perspective, this is quite problematic, perhaps. Why? Because not many things are going to happen necessarily in the next year. unless you have a scenario whereby the transition takes place very quickly. You need there's a debate about whether the ECB should consider a long-run horizon or not. But so far, the credit analysis is very much focused on what is going to happen in the next year. What we do is that, as I said before, we download all the data about the eligible bonds, we do this analysis, we rely on Refinitiv Icon, we use specific data related to corporate issuers, and let me go to the results and show you what we get depending on the approach. So let me start with the climate footprint approach. What I have here is the initial decomposition of the bond issuers that are included in the collateral, depending on their performance. So we have, with the red colors, the poor and very poor climate performers that have taken a value that assigns them to climate buckets C or D, the bad ones, and the green ones correspond to climate buckets A and B. So initially, the representation of the two bad climate buckets is quite high. And what we do is that we adjust haircuts in order to reduce the haircut adjusted outstanding amount related to the poor and very poor climate performance. So in the second column, you can see that red goes down because of that. There is a way to reduce this even more. So, but it depends on how exactly you want to adjust haircuts. But the idea is that you have the flexibility to reduce the climate footprint of the collateral framework. And then the other thing that we do, and this is in the last column, we also exclude some very, very bad climate performance, fossil fuel companies that get very bad scores from a climate perspective, and they have plans to expand the use of fossil fuels. And this is the third column where red goes down a little bit more. The idea here is that with the climate footprint approach, you can do this adjustment. And in terms of haircuts, this is how things look like. So for the very poor climate performance, the initial haircut, the average haircut is about 6%. So quite low, even though they are very bad for climate. And we increase this to about 10.2% in the second column, where we adjust the haircuts. And then we exclude some of them, so haircuts don't change so much in the last column. But the idea is that when you increase the haircuts for the very poor climate performance, you need to reduce haircuts for green performance in order to keep the collateral more or less at the same level. So you can see for the very strong climate performance, the haircuts go down quite substantially. And they go down even more when we exclude some fossil companies, because then it's necessary to adjust the haircuts for good climate performance to keep collateral more or less at the same level. So this is the adjustment that we do in terms of haircuts in the climate footprint approach. Things are very, very different when we use the climate risk exposure approach. So what we do here is that we consider the three different scenarios that I mentioned before: the current policy scenarios, the delayed transition scenario, and the net zero scenario. And for each one of these scenarios, we estimate probabilities of default. We do that for 1 year initially, so for 2024. And then we also do this for 2031 because we want to see what happens if we have a different horizon. Now, what do we see here? We see that overall, only in the net zero scenario in 2024, there is a difference in terms of haircuts. So you can see that the average haircut for the current policy scenarios is 8.4%. In the net zero, it becomes 9.2%. So higher than what we have in the current policies. Why? Because we have a carbon price that is applied to the cost of firms, and this reduces the profitability of firms, and therefore firms have to, become more financially fragile, and therefore probability of default goes up, and therefore haircuts go up. If you look at green bonds, you will see that their haircut also goes up. Why? Because irrespective of the type of bond that you issue, if you have some emissions and there is a carbon price, you have to pay. So you become more financially fragile, and from the risk perspective, the haircut should be higher. So this approach, penalizes a bit more carbon-intensive buildings or carbon-intensive transport, carbon-intensive utilities. There are significant differences, but it can also penalize some green issuers. So it doesn't make this distinction. Now, when we look at 2031, we don't see significant differences. The delayed transition scenario, whereby carbon prices start increasing after 2031, also generates a small increase in haircuts. So haircuts increase in this scenario. But we don't see very significant differences because of the fact that you have to go up to 2040 or so in order to see very, very high carbon prices in the net zero and delayed transition scenario. So what does it mean in practice? It means that according to this approach, you do not necessarily incentivize green compared to dirty. Why? Because everything is about risks. And the main question is how much you are exposed to risks. Of course, carbon-intensive companies will have to pay more, so they will be considered to be more risky, but it's difficult to see very significant changes that would make a difference in terms of the cost of borrowing. So let me conclude, and sorry that it took me a bit more time than I expected. When we look at these two different approaches, the two key differences from a results perspective is that, as I said before, with the risk exposure approach, you will not increase haircuts sufficiently for carbon-intensive companies compared to what is the case with the climate footprint approach. There will be also cases whereby you're going to penalize green bonds and some green issuers. From a climate perspective, this is not great. From a risk perspective, it's consistent. Now, the second implication is that if we see significant increases in transition risks in the coming years, then on average, haircuts will go up, and it means that it will be more difficult for banks to have enough collateral to get access to central bank liquidity. So central banks will need to do something about that. They will need perhaps to expand the collateral as they did during COVID-19, but they have to do something about that, because if they just focus on risks, overall haircuts will go up. So from that perspective, there will be some trade-offs. And let me also say that, as I said, this is still work in progress. We're going to do a very detailed sensitivity analysis to see how things change when we change some specific weights and parameter values. We haven't still incorporated the green investment channel, which can have some implications in terms of the levels of haircuts. So we are working on that. But hopefully I managed to explain what is more or less the idea behind the paper and why this is important, and how the different options can have implications for financial stability, for climate, and for overall for monetary policy implementation. So thanks a lot, and I look forward to your reactions.
Yeah. Wow, thank you so much, Yannis. It's a very thorough paper, actually, a project. I think I understand. At the start, I said, this is beyond my research reach, but I think I understand what you have said. So your target is to influence policy. And actually, my first question is, do you think those policymakers from ECB listen to you? So you target their policy too. So you want to try to influence the haircut so that you influence the bond market price, demand for the bond, and the bond market price, therefore the cost of borrowing for the firm. So through the cost of borrowing, you either promote climate effort, or you discourage them. So you looked at two approaches. So how you approach this? So you checked the footprint, so their performance, their behavior, activities, and also you measured the risk exposure. By the second approach, risk exposure approach, you influence the cost of borrowing, let's say, because you influence the cost of emission. So, and through that, you you try to calculate the probability of default for the firms. So let me kick off the questions. So since I think I understand, can you confirm this, Yannis? Do I understand?
Yeah,
correctly?
sure. Yeah, of course.
Great,
You
great.
described very well what.
So let me ask you maybe the following question. First of all, I think you did a very thorough technical work in constructing the index or try to estimate the cost of emission and the different scenarios. But I think the first approach, so your result shows that you found some positive impact by working through the footprint approach, which is good news. But I see a lot of subjectivity in your construction of the index. So you looked at the issuers and you looked at their whether you compare them with their peers. You looked at what they have done in the past, and you looked at their plan in the future. So only for the plan, I would say there may be some subjective elements there. And how do you determine this is a green plan or not? And I remember in the second element activity, you subjectively determine the proportion of the activity that belong to green. So I see quite a lot of things like that. And I just want to ask you whether what you have done here, whether you have some references or you want to be the leading reference. But that's my feeling for the first approach. A lot of subjectivities here when you are constructing that index, because that is important. By index, again, subjectively, you classify those bond issuers into 4 types. So how do you do that? What is the objective criterion based on which you do this? So that's my first one. On the second approach, I see that you did a lot of derivation, and you have data, you have some basis. However, I'm thinking about my own field. So imagine there's no climate things. There's no cost of emission years ago. We still talk about the probability of default for companies. For that, we consider a lot of other factors. We have to, there are some agencies, there are some, consultants who estimate, let's say, Alibaba's probability of default. But they consider a lot of other things rather than the cost of emission. So where can I see those factors? So the differences between before and now is that you introduced the cost of emission and you estimated the cost of emission and you added this into there to estimate the overall cost of financing, and therefore that affects the probability of default. So where are those factors? So that's my second major comments, I think, on your second approach. I would like to know more about that. In addition, for the first approach, you focused on the bond issuers. For the second approach, you focused on companies. So my third question may be, what are the connections between those two approaches? Are you talking about the same group of firms or companies? So that's my comments for the moment.
Thank you so much for the great comments and questions. They make a lot of sense, and they will allow me to explain a little bit more a few things about the paper. So first of all, let me start with what you said at the beginning about policy impact. I mean, there is a history behind this paper because we worked with Greenpeace for a few years, and actually we wrote a lot of papers about the ECB, and Lagarde received all these papers through Greenpeace. And actually, one of our first paper in 2020 was about the quantitative easing program of the ECB. And it was when Lagarde joined the ECB and she wanted to introduce a climate agenda. So she also used a little bit our report to create some internal pressure on that. And while we initially, when they, in terms of the quantitative easing program, when we made some suggestions in this report about how this program could incorporate climate criteria, initially the ECB reaction was not great, apart from Lagarde. But after 2 years, they more or less did what we have in the report. I mean, the whole idea was similar. And I mean, we have engaged quite a lot with them. I mean, as Lagarde asked us to talk to the technical team to discuss the report. We had some round tables. So we have engaged quite a lot with them. And the reason why we have done this work is not only for ECB, it's also for other central banks, because they can look at this and they can do similar stuff. And through the Center for Sustainable Finance, we do capacity building, for instance, for central banks in Southeast Asia. And there's also a lot of interest in that stuff there. They don't have exactly the same tools, but they can use some ideas about these tools in order to do what they think is good for them. So we are engaging quite a lot with policymakers from that. And as you said rightly at the beginning, yes, one of the purposes is to have an impact. And it's quite important for us. Now, you're very correct about the fact that there is some subjectivity whenever we try to measure climate performance. Let me say that there are two aspects. There are some aspects that are more objective than others, like carbon emissions. So when we look at the carbon emissions that companies have generated so far, I mean, this is initially something in principle that is subjective. Of course, there are problems with how we estimate emissions, but I think we have made a lot of progress, and now these estimates are more accurate. So this is one significant starting point for us. I didn't want to go so much into the literature and how we build on what other people have done. I mean, these indicators, we started developing them a few years ago for other papers. But as I said before, they're also very close to what, at the end of the day, the Bank of England and ECB did. So there is a literature behind this, and policymakers have also used this. The climate buckets that we used, I mean, the Bank of England had exactly the same buckets, 4 climate buckets for the AQE program. And of course, there are issues with how exactly you develop your metrics. This is why I also said that we are doing some sensitivity analysis to understand to what extent the results or the classification of companies changes if we change significantly some of these more subjective decisions. I mean, when we do that, we don't see very significant changes, but there are some changes. So it's important to report exactly what happens if you change some of the values in these indicators. In terms of greenwashing, this is always a risk. What we can do is to try to reduce the risk of greenwashing. And this is why we also look at the activities of companies. So there's no way to get rid of that. But this is a reality with climate, to be honest. And at the end of the day, there are also some political decisions. For instance, do you want to accept your collateral companies that have plans to expand their coal activity? I mean, from a climate perspective, the answer is clear, but it's also a decision that you have to make from a policy perspective. Or when policymakers decide about the value of the carbon price. At the end of the day, it's a political decision. So the challenge with the climate footprint approach is that it involves policy decisions. I think there is an objective element that has to do with some climate metrics, but the combination of some political decisions with how exactly you develop the metrics creates some subjectivity, which in my view is unavoidable if you want to contribute to the reduction of emissions. You need to make some decisions about how exactly you are going to evaluate that. So the only way to deal with that subjectivity in the paper is to be very clear on what different decisions mean for haircuts and eligibility. This is why it's important for us to have this sensitivity analysis in order to illustrate how things might change. But at the end of the day, we're going to present the options. And the idea is for the ECB or any other central bank to decide what they're going to do. At the end of the day, when financial regulators, central banks take decisions, there's also a political element. I mean, even when you think about capital requirements and all this financial regulation stuff, there are a lot of arbitrary numbers there, but it's part of the policy process. So yeah, I agree with your comment, but it's the only way for us to deal with that, to be very explicit and clear and present the implications of different assumptions. Now, in terms of the probabilities of default, let me clarify, because I didn't go so much into details, that what we do is that probability of default depends on profitability and leverage that can be affected by everything. I mean, not just from climate. What we do is that we introduce these additional channels into the analysis. So we have that there is a baseline scenario for how profitability and leverage will change irrespective of climate policies. And then on top of this traditional financial channels, we have the climate channels. So, and what we are interested in is to understand to what extent probabilities of default will change if we introduce these additional channels. But the analysis that we have done is quite standard when we remove the climate channels. And let me also clarify that we have bond issuers which are companies. So sometimes I use the word company, sometimes the word bond issuers. That's why I confuse you, but it's exactly the same sample of companies that issue bonds. So these are exactly the same. So yes, on the climate stress test, I mean, we incorporated the traditional financial channels, and the regressions that the ECB has used for that rely on financial data in the past. So it's not that we make a contribution there. Our contribution is to talk about the climate. Yeah. So, I mean, and this makes, just to say that the risk analysis can be a little bit more objective, let's say, because, I mean, you have a model, you always make assumptions, but it's more standard. I think the challenge with the other approach is that people can have different views about, how important it is to penalize a company that doesn't have good targets. And I agree with your point that this makes this more challenging. The risk approach can be very easily accepted by the ECB. They have already accepted that, and they're willing to extend their analysis to incorporate climate risks.
Great. So you expanded quite a lot. So you provided us more information, and now I think it's very helpful. I learned a lot. So I didn't do anything climate myself, but it makes a lot of sense, and it's very thorough. I hope you have the good result in terms of the, you need to you need to sell them somewhere. So I'm sure. So now I think we will have a lot of colleagues who are very interested, in this topic. So could I invite people to join us for the discussion? Do I have some hands? Yes, Jaideep. So please.
Thanks, thanks, Yannis. This was really interesting. So just to follow up on this probability of default thing, right? So basically, your assumption is that the risks, climate risks, are not incorporated in current prices. Is that correct?
More or less, yes. But in our analysis, the idea is that the way that markets evaluate what is going to happen is not in line with the net zero scenario, right? And I mean, just to say, there are a lot of empirical studies that have analyzed this issue, and the conclusion is that there might have been some evaluation of climate risks recently over the last years, but it's very, very, I mean, the adjustment in prices has been very low compared to what you might get if you have a very ambitious climate policy scenario. So you're right that implicitly this is what we assume as a kind of a baseline, because let me say again that the ECB looks at the probability of default for the next year. So basically, nobody actually expects a very significant increase in carbon prices in the next year. So given that, even though there might be some evaluation of climate risk, this is very minor right now. And then we just say, if this is not the scenario that's going to materialize, what is going to happen?
Because there's another element of climate risk, which is, so for example, real estate, right? We know there's evidence of climate risk being priced in real estate, and it's a different type of risk. It's the kind of the impact of the risk, not the cause, but the sort of like the reception of risk rather than the generation of it. So you seem to be focused on the generation of risk rather than the reception of it to a great extent. So I wonder, like how you sort of balance those two things.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. We call it physical risks, actually. If you are talking about real estate risk related, let's say, to floods, we have this distinction between transition risk and physical risk. So transition risk, what I analyzed in the paper. Physical risk is the risk related to climate-related events that can lead to reduction in the value of properties, defaults because firms cannot, they seek a distraction of their factories and so on. Now, that's a very good question, because in this specific paper, we have decided not to go into physical risks for two reasons. One reason is that it's difficult to find the right data to do this properly in the paper. Second reason is that the paper is already too big to analyze this as well. But it can be another paper that will analyze specifically physical risks. And the third reason is that we don't expect our results from a conceptual point of view to be significantly different, in the sense that what you get with physical risks is that in the coming years, you might have a small increase in probabilities of default. You will have much more significant changes in probabilities of default after 2030, 2035 or so, when you look at these scenarios about the increase in global warming. And this is too far for the ECB from a climate risk perspective. And actually, our point is that if you take into account, on top of transition risk, the physical risks, you will end up with a much narrower collateral pool, right? Because then everything is going to get higher haircuts. And then the question is how the ECB is going to react to that. And the answer is perhaps what happened during COVID-19. So what they did during COVID-19 was that they said, okay, we're going to accept lower quality bonds for 1 or 2 years in order to make sure that banks will have access to liquidity. And I expect something very similar if they follow the risk approach. Now, the problem with that, in the case of physical risks, is that you will start to penalize those companies that perhaps don't have any responsibility for climate change, but they are close to a forest where there will be a wildfire, they're close to a river, there will be a flood. And my view is that this will be quite problematic if we enter, let's say in 10 years, if we have something like that, because then it will be too late to change things, and the ECB basically will have to deal with the fact that some bonds will not be considered to be of very good quality, not because they contribute to climate problem, but simply because they are exposed to the results of climate change. So it's very interesting to analyze physical risks as well, and it's important for the paper, but we have decided not to go into that in this specific paper.
Okay, because for me, it was like, I think it's, I don't know, maybe I misunderstood, but it seems to me more urgent, the physical risk, from a central banker's perspective, because it's happening now. And like you can see that the bond prices are affected, security prices are affected by physical risk at the moment. And so, of course, that's going to actually affect the prices of the securities in the markets and their marketability and so on. Whereas transition risk is more an incentivization problem, whereas this is a kind of like urgent problem. And so I'm just curious, because you've also said in one of the things that, so just my last question really is that it seems the implication is that if this is not incorporated in the haircuts, then actually we are looking at a mispriced set of bonds at the moment. So your suggestion is that this that basically it's going to come suddenly, this massive shock to the value of the bonds is going to arrive suddenly, and the central banks will not be sort of ready for it in a sense. So is that a conclusion that I can also draw based on your second part of your analysis on the risk?
I mean, more or less. First of all, let me say that initially we wanted to incorporate physical risk. So I agree with you that it's very relevant. We just have a challenge in terms of finding the right data to do this properly and not to overextend the paper. So I agree with you that it's important, and perhaps we'll do this in a second paper, to be honest. But in terms of the points, I mean, one of the main points of the paper is that, let's say that the ECB does properly the job of incorporating both transition and physical risks. What is going to happen? You can have a better pricing of risks from a very traditional perspective. In practice, this means overall higher haircuts for everyone, right? So, and with physical risks, it will be even worse. And what I saw with the transition risk is that you might have also higher haircuts even for those that issue, let's say, green bonds, simply because they have emissions. So you cannot use that in order to incentivize anything. But this is not the purpose of this approach. But what you have with the risk approach is that you end up with a higher systemic risk that is across the system. And then you just need to accept that you need to change your evaluation of credit quality, which is not consistent with the approach. Because if the approach is consistent, then you need to say, okay, overall there's more risk. You really need to focus only on those bonds that are protected from transition and physical risks, which will become much more difficult as time passes. And our point is that, of course, ideally, from a systems perspective, we would like to see the transition happening relatively smoothly. And if the central banks just say, it's not our job, they're going to have a problem in any case from this. And what we're saying is that central banks are not going to resolve the problem, but they can contribute to the solution. So if they decide to say, okay, we're going to contribute to the net zero target of the European Union, because it's part of the secondary mandate of the ECB. And actually the ECB, when they decided to decarbonize their QE program, they referred to that. They said, okay, as long as we do QE in line with inflation targeting, we can reallocate within the QE without changing the size. The size is determined by inflation, because we want to support the secondary mandate, which is to support government policies. By doing that, you can contribute to the gradual decarbonization of the financial system, which is good also from a global perspective, because it means that if there is decarbonization in the rest of the world, you are more prepared for that. But you also contribute to the reduction of emissions, because you create an additional pressure on companies. And of course, for this to work, we need many central banks doing something similar across the world and many governments. But from a systems perspective, this would be the ideal scenario. Not everyone to wait and see the risks, but to act on that collectively. And this moves beyond the more standard way of thinking about collateral. This is why someone could say that this approach is not very good. But we are going to have problems in 10 years or so, in any case, with from a risk perspective. And then I think it's arbitrary to just say, okay, we're going to expand the collateral, as they do during crisis.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jaideep, for the questions. I think we have a very good insightful discussion here. I see a hand by Wango or Florian. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Hi, this is Florian. I'm Uli's PhD student. I would like to ask a question about the transmission channels that you presented. So I understand that they're based on a paper presented by the ECB itself. But I guess there's more than the 4 transmission channels that you presented here. So I wanted to understand how you selected them, or why you think that those are the most relevant ones. And also, when it comes to energy prices, for example, I guess there's big differences among regions, because Europe is also so diverse, and the energy structures in every country are different. So do you assume that there's one price for a renewable energy, or do you assume different prices across countries? And also these are all microeconomic transmission channels, right? Do you also consider macroeconomic transmission channels?
Thank you so much. Great questions, Florian. Yeah, so first of all, in terms of transmission channels, I mean, we're using the analysis that the ECB has done in the top-down stress testing exercise. So we have used most of the channels that they have. One channel that I didn't have explicitly in the slide is related to how much the revenues of companies can go down if we have an increase in inflation because of the increase in carbon prices. And this can be a kind of economy-wide effect. But these are micro channels only, right? This is why I didn't talk about the broader macro channels. And this is also a kind of a limitation of stress testing exercise that do not have, let's say, macro models whereby finance is part of them. So if you look, for instance, at the transmission channels from a macro perspective, there are a lot of effects related to economic growth that goes down, inflation that increases. You might have that because banks face risks, they reduce credit availability, and this can have feedback effects on the economy. So from a macro perspective, I mean, in the macro modeling work that we do, we also look into this channel specifically. But for this exercise, to be honest, we wanted to be close to this micro perspective of the ECB because we wanted to replicate what the ECB is more likely to do if they follow the climate risk approach. And if you want to analyze the macro channels as well, you need to have a quite sophisticated macro model to do that. So actually, you can have additional macro channels that can make the situation even worse when you do that, which means that the haircuts can increase even more, perhaps. But this is not how ECB is doing this analysis, and we're going to be close to what the ECB does. So I agree with you that in general there are many other channels, but we're going to be close to what the ECB does. And from that perspective, our channels are more or less the same as in the channels that they have for the transition risk analysis. So I can also send you the paper that we're using. It's a 2023 paper that focuses on the transition in the EU. Let me clarify that we use NGFS scenarios, and these NGFS scenarios have different energy prices per country. So we make this differentiation. So depending on what is the country of the bond issuer, we assign the price that corresponds to the country. So in that sense, we take this into account. I mean, just to say, I'm not necessarily a big fan of the NGFS scenarios. I mean, I think there are a lot of issues with them, but are the only scenarios that we can use in order to be very close to what the ECB does. But I agree with you, it's important to take into account the country perspective.
Thanks, Florian. I now can recall you. So we know each other, right? You know me, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Of course. So well done. Well done. So good question. And I think we really have some audience who understands this, this area. So the topic and this area. So can I have more hands, or do we have more questions here? Very quiet. So actually, I have a reserve question for you, actually for everybody. Yannis, so I know everybody is talking about this. Is a so popular topic, and of course the issue is very, very important for sustainability for everybody here. But I also hear quite a lot of debate about cost of green. Yeah, so you mentioned in your model, in your paper, actually, there is a transition period. If you ask them to decarbonize, then they need to use some others. So substitutes, electricity, or maybe some others. So therefore, there is additional cost that is involved in this green transition. I'm not against of green transition. I like to see that, but but it's more like people are talking about the ideal situation. So people think that this is, yes, we are moving forward, but costly, let's say. So there is a debate. Even the politicians are changing their tones about, before they talked about this is our selling point, but the green, but then they gave them up because it is too costly. So my question, to think about it, green climate transformation, they require a lot of other inputs. Let's say people are talking about critical minerals, yeah? And the competition for that is, that you politically fight, the competition is fierce, and that distorted the market of those natural resources, particularly those important, critical minerals, let's say. So what do you think about that? You are proposing, you are working, on this topic. So what do you really think about it? So what is the cost of doing so? Whether or not this is really promising, let's say, and how can we pass this transformation period? For them, what is the cost?
Yeah, that's a very great question, also a complicated one. But I agree with you that it's very important because one of the things that we have seen over the last years, as you said, is that politicians have changed their green agenda in a way that goes against the climate targets, actually. So initially, even in the UK, there were some more ambitious targets, and then politicians decided to change them. And it's the same in many countries around the world. So it's a very important question. I think the problem is that sometimes there's a short-run horizon, of course. So we focus on the cost. We don't focus on what will be better after 20 years or so, because of course after 20 years or so, if we have made the transition, things will be better. Now, in terms of the short-run cost, if you think about that, we need to make some additional investment, of course. But we also need, that will say how we can finance this in a bit, but we also need to take into account that we still make a lot of new investments in, let's say, fossil-related infrastructure. And if you have, let's say, money, and you have the option of investing in a green infrastructure and a fossil infrastructure, and you go for the fossil infrastructure, it's not that the costs are higher, because right now, there's a difference in terms of the horizon of cost. So the initial cost for renewable energy are higher because you need to build capacity. But then once you have the capacity to produce electricity from renewables, actually you have zero cost later, because renewables do not have very low marginal costs. So there is a difference in terms of the horizon, but the overall cost is not necessarily different. And because of the fact that we don't have policies that provide the right incentives, with the money that we use right now, we still invest in stuff that is bad for climate. So I think there is not a cost issue, it's an issue of decisions that we take. Now, of course, we need to create some additional infrastructure to deal with, to reduce emissions. And this additional infrastructure requires more money. So the question is, where does this money can come from? And I think it could be a combination of private debt and public debt at the end of the day. This is not necessarily a problem, to be honest, because we have done that in the past when we had, after wars, when it was necessary to reconstruct economies. If you develop capacity and if you invest by creating more debt, you're also in a position perhaps to repay this debt if it's private debt. And there are some countries in the world that, like the US, that, they don't have a problem to increase their public debt, if we want to be completely honest, because they have dollar, which is a very strong currency, and they're not going to face defaults if they increase the public debt. So there are options, especially for developed countries, to rely on debt creation, private. Also banks create money nowadays, right? The question is how this money is used. And if you look at how money has been used, for instance, in the UK, most of this money has gone into the housing market and has contributed to the increase in prices. So there are choices that can be made in terms of how you use the money that is created. And of course, there will be trade-offs, right? But if you just say, okay, let's postpone the problem, the costs and the efforts will increase even more if you're going to make the transition. As you postpone, if we started this discussion 25 years ago, I mean, the technologies were not so great as they are now in the green sector, but we had enough time to gradually build the capacity to produce energy differently. Now we have to do everything very quickly, and this also increases, let's say, the cost. But I think the problem is that economists for many years presented this as a cost. And in my view, if we also have a narrative about creation of some green jobs that can stimulate the economy, because in any case we have low growth in many countries, investing in the green economy can also stimulate economic activity and jobs. If we have a different narrative, I think it would be easier also for politicians to get more support for that. So I think we have got the narrative wrong. I mean, it's not that there are no trade-offs, but everyone is talking about costs and nobody is talking about the benefits that we have from that process. And there is a way to deal with costs, but we just need also to consider that the benefits. Otherwise, it's a very easy argument to say, this is costly, let's continue business as usual.
Actually, I have to say, I agree. So no matter how hard it is, we have to move forward. Otherwise, because we cannot really going backward, right? So we have to do something with respect to the climate risks. So I see Rosemary. Hi, Rose.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I just have one question. Mm-hmm. How do you anticipate the integration of emission-based climate indices would influence the behavior of bond issuers and also the broader financial market, and what adjustments or shifts in investor preferences and strategies do you expect to emerge as a result of incorporating these metrics?
Mm-hmm. Thank you a lot. And it's a very important question, because at the end of the day, it's very important to understand how what we suggest could have a real impact. So from my perspective, the ideal way would be to have that the ECB announces the criteria. And I mean, it would also be good to give some time to companies to adjust to that, to take into account what the criteria will be about their climate evaluation. And then it's also very important for the ECB, as they do with the list of bonds that they put on their website, to also announce which company belongs to which climate bucket. Why is that the case? I mean, as long as they give them some time to do something about that. But at some point, they need to announce that, because this will give a very strong signal to the financial markets about which companies perform well or not. Right now, we rely on ESG scores that have a lot of problems in terms of how exactly they measure climate performance. And they also combine this with S and G, so social and governance. And this is very tricky, because markets cannot easily evaluate what is good from a climate perspective, because if they have 8-9 different data providers, I mean, who knows what they actually follow. If you have a public authority, like a central bank, saying that those who issue bonds are evaluated in that way, and the methodology is very clear, and these are those who don't perform well, you create two different incentives. One incentive is that, first of all, there will be less demand, because these bond issues will not be in the collateral framework. Second, the financial markets will see these bond issuers as those who don't follow, what is coming, because there will be a signal from the ECB that they care about climate. So those who don't do stuff on climate, they will have problems. And I think this signal channel that I mentioned at some point in my lecture in my presentation is important, because it's not only to affect directly the interest rates right now, but also to provide a kind of a forward-looking signal to markets saying, if you don't do stuff, there will be a problem. And now, the pressure in practice will be that not so many financial players would like to have bonds of these companies. And then the shareholders of these companies will need to take some decisions. They will need to say, for instance, I mean, if they care about their cost of borrowing and their ability to get access to finance from the financial markets, then we need to take decisions about having emissions targets, reducing emissions in the coming years, stop having fossil expansion plans if they are fossil fuel companies, issue some new green bonds, they connect these bonds with specific projects. And if you think about that, I mean, many companies now try to do more stuff on climate. The problem is that everything is voluntary. If you have a public authority that says, there will be some penalties if you don't act, I think this will create some pressure. And again, it's not going to change completely the strategies of companies, because it's not enough to just change the cost of borrowing. You need at the same time to have governments having regulations about climate investments. You need to have some carbon pricing, of course, but this will contribute from the perspective of the financial markets. This is the idea. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the idea is very clear. So, Jeffrey, you have a question, right? Come on, please.
Yes. Hello. Thank you, Yannis, for your presentation. My comment is regarding your last comment that you made, and I think you mentioned it when you were doing the presentation, that you are not a fan of the ESG measure, and which you just explained briefly why you are not. I was wondering whether you could tell us more about that, because the reason that the most central banks, including the ECB, are introducing mandatory ESG reporting is to account for two important things. One, information asymmetry, which I think you have not considered in your study, and two, because the idea of climate risk or green behavior cannot be measured in isolation. You must look, companies, banks, or other financial institutions or bond issuers are profit-making organizations, which is their primary objective. So the idea that we can abandon all other characteristics to focus on climate behavior, I think it's over-optimistic, because the reason that they have introduced governance and all of that is to capture, at the end of the day, you produce this report by, say, auditors report it, then you have the directors at the top who their performance are being evaluated on the basis of profit they have made and all of that. So you need to sort of incorporate all of this. So I was wondering whether you think, well, I'm not sure what the focus of the study is, but I think it's important to sort of account for all these different characteristics to get the full picture and why financial institutions and other bond issuers behave the way they do when it comes to climate finance, climate risk. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. That's a very good question. And yeah, it will give me the chance to clarify exactly what I said before. So I think, of course, it's very important for companies to report and have disclosure about E, S, and G indicators. What I don't like is when we have data providers that put all these indicators together and produce some ESG scores, and all of them use their own methodology, which is very different depending on the data provider. And then some people just go and see the ESG score, and then we really don't know what this captures, because it can be sometimes, for instance, in the case of emissions, we have that they compare companies with their peers only, and you can have a fossil company that is better than another fossil fuel company, gets a very good E-score, and then you wonder why this is happening. So for me, it's very important to have very transparent methods in terms of how we estimate this stuff. So if you have a report that has all the information about E, S, and G, and then you decide about this information in terms of how good the company performs, that's fine. If you have ESG indicators, this is where I have a problem, because for me, it's a kind of a black box. And when the ECB and the Bank of England decided to evaluate the climate performance of companies, they didn't want to use these ESG indicators. They used actually a part of the ESG indicators, which is emissions. It's one of the things that are taken into account in E. And they developed their own metrics based on that. So I'm very happy with that. I'm just saying that I would like to see very clear methodologies in terms of what you see in specific reports. And sometimes this is not happening, but the reports where you get all this information about the sub-indicators, I think they are very useful. And of course, we need to have this disclosure. Now, when it comes to risks, I think sometimes there's a kind of a confusion. Why? Because with ESG, if you look at the indicators, you can have an indicator about emissions and an indicator about exposure to physical risks. So when I look at the E score, I don't know if this captures some exposure to risk or if this captures some climate performance based on emissions. And again, by putting them together, I don't know how exactly to evaluate the information. And when we look at risks, for me, it makes more sense to focus on what might happen in terms of the financial position of company. If ESG indicators, the sub-indicators in particular, give me some information, let's use this information and do my own analysis based on scenarios. And this is also what the ECB has done for the stress testing exercise. It's not that they don't use some parts of E specifically, but they do their own credit risk analysis based on that. So for me, I would like to see full transparency across the board, not just on the data, but also on methodologies. This was basically my point, just to clarify this. And in my view, at least in the case of climate, and I agree with you that S and G are important, and we need to look at this in combination, of course, when we are looking at broader socioeconomic issues, including climate. So, of course, we need to look at that as well, depending on the purpose of the analysis, of course. Now, when we look at E and we do our own analysis, I think it's important to have some agreement on some methodology. So when the European Commission developed the EU taxonomy, they wanted to develop a kind of a standard that financial investors can, for instance, look at and analyze more objectively, let's say. I mean, according to a common methodology, how companies perform. So having some common methodologies that are public, I think this helps. Otherwise, it can create some confusion about who performs better than others. This was basically my point, that we have seen some confusion with ESG. As long as we improve that, of course, it's very useful to have all this information.
Okay, I think that is that sort of what you just explained. Sort of agree with what I was trying to end with, which means we need to incorporate all other factors rather than focusing entirely on climate. And also, so what you just explained, does that mean the focus should be how to sort of improve the measure or how to introduce a uniform model across, say, all banking sectors, so that when you see an ESG measure, you know what is in it, that everyone knows this is the measure. If that is the way forward, then I think that is what we should sort of try to improve rather than focusing on just climate. That's my point. But thank you for clarifying that.
Thanks.
Great. I think, Yannis, you explained very well. So you focused on E for this paper, for this project. And I can see the connection between E and the financing. It's very close, actually. There is a market even for emissions. So there is a token that you can trade. So it's a kind of, I can see the logical here, the rationale behind this. And this is basically a policy-oriented paper and focusing on the policies regarding the financial market. So I think for me, I think is logical, and of course we can do S and G and incorporate S and G as much as possible. And I think those things are more, you need another model probably. It's better to have another model, more economic orientated model, I would say. So that's my, so I think we are almost there. And I didn't see any hands. Are there any urgent hands still? No? Okay, that's very good. Thank you very much. And I think, Yannis, you have you have done very thoroughly for this paper, and I hope people. I do not know from different point of view, but people can take something home. And I would like to thank you very much for your time and for your patience in discussing, responding the questions and expanding so that we understand your project much better as compared to the beginning of this seminar. And I thank audience who contributed to this seminar, to the discussion, and for your time just being here and to learn. And this is our last one for this academic year. I hope you will be. I think you will hear from our center manager in terms of the next year's presentation plan. And I hope you continue to support the center and to present your best research here so that we can learn from each other. Yannis, do you have anything to say? So I think I need to close this session.
Yeah, I mean, just to say many thanks for organizing this. Many thanks for engaging with the paper. I mean, even though it was not the paper that was close to the research interests of many people, I mean, I had great questions, and many thanks for all this. And we will take your feedback into account, and we'll talk to my authors as well in terms of your questions, because we are still thinking about some parts of the paper. And yeah, your feedback was very, very helpful. And yeah, thanks a lot for doing this and for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope the policymakers listens more to your research. So thanks everybody. All the best. I will see you then next maybe in October now. So yeah, thank you. Have a good break. Bye.
Bye-bye.